Well, hey, so we got the tough lecture out of the way, the most controversial lecture out of the way, which is evolution. I can tell you that probably this one is even more controversial. You know why? Because we are all in the church, we all read the Bible, we all read the biblical text, and we all think we know what the text says. But then it becomes very hard to make sense. In fact, I would tell you that this lecture is even more controversial than the previous one. So for the previous one, your minds were kind of a bit, overwhelmed. This one is even more. But what did we come up with the last lecture? We came up from the last lecture that at least the scientific evidence, and I think this is the conclusion of that. The scientific evidence is really controversial. That whether or not evolution from a single cell ancestry, common ancestry, is a valid point or not. Remember what I said about the evidence and the observational science versus experimental. The crux of the matter is as follows. Based on the observational science of what we're seeing at this point of our genetic composition, we're finding a lot of enigmas. And we, as a group of scientists, are trying to make sense of these enigmas and to explain. Could we all have evolved from a single cell? And if yes, what was the mechanism? Okay? And the difficulty is when we are using experimental science versus observational science, and when those overlap. As I said, the genetic evidence for common cell ancestry is quite strong. It is quite strong, even though for us as Christians, it was like, I wish this was not the case. But that biological evidence, if you're going to take it from a scientific standpoint, is quite compelling. However, saying that, what is not compelling and what is still being very debated is the mechanism. How did we get to that point? Was this mechanism an evolutionary process in its entirety? Or was it also guided in some sense? And I presented to you the two big groups of Christian scientists, one of them called the intelligent design camp, and the other one called the theistic evolution camp. I would probably tell you for most part, both camps do believe in common ancestry, okay? I think the big debate between them is the mechanism and how that mechanism comes. So, Biological Apologetics 2015. In essentials, unity. In non-essentials, liberty. In all, charity and humility. I would put that in addition there. Genesis 1-3, can we reach an agreement? The problem with Genesis 1-3, you've got several questions. You've got the question of beginning of the cosmos. And then you go from the beginning of the cosmos to the beginning of life. And then from the beginning of that first cell to the beginning of man. And then the problem, and here the best analogy I can give is that for this complexity, you are as if you're going on a railroad. You know the railroad, guys? You've got a train, you've got a track and another one, and they both have to remain parallel all throughout the way for the train to move, correct? If one track is off by an angle, can that train move? It cannot. And this exact analogy applies to us because on one track, you've got the biblical interpretation. The issue that we're going to debate in this lecture is not the biblical text in of itself. The text has no problem. It's the interpretation that has question marks. And the other one is the scientific interpretation. For any one of us here, I would challenge all of us that all of us have to make our minds and our decision on both tracks. Because on both tracks, if one of them is going left and the other one is going right, you are going to be stuck and you're going to be confused. But your scientific understanding has to match your theological and biblical understanding. And you will find, and I'll show you at the end of this lecture, based on the current different biblical interpretations, how these scientific camps, both theistic evolution and intelligent design, which biblical interpretation do they adopt? Am I saying that's right? I'm not saying that. I'm saying I'm presenting you the different camps and the different interpretation. I'll go back to the first lecture when I said, you know what, go and do your research. Go and do your own reading. But the complexity of this railroad is this is what it looks like. This is exactly what it looks like. Because not only you've got 5 to 6 to 7 different scientific interpretations, you have 5 to 7 different biblical interpretations, and then you can almost mix and match as a scientist any different scientific interpretation and marry it to a different biblical interpretation, and this is who you would be. Can I say, well, this is truth versus this is truth versus this is truth? I'll be very, very, very ignorant and tell you I cannot really make a dogmatic statement about evolution and the biblical account from Genesis, except in 3 statements. Number 1, that God created all. Number 2, God created all out of nothing and for good. And number 3, God created all out of nothing for good and for man's glory. The how and the when, I would be very ignorant to tell you that I don't think I can be 100% dogmatic, and I will show you the evidence for that. This is the biological lay of the land, and we talked about it that you've got the creationist on one side, you've got the intelligent design and theistic evolutionist in the middle, and then you've got the Darwinist, if I may say, who does not believe, in God at all, on the other side. The creationists, as we probably already know, the young earth creationists believe that Earth, its entire universe, everything was created within 6,000 to 7,000 years, including the universe, including the earth, including mankind, including Adam, including everything. Okay? The old earth creationists are probably a mix and match because there's multiple camps within this big family. They believe that the earth and the universe are ancient, but mankind as we know it is only 6,000 to 7,000 years. And then you've got the ID camp and the theistic evolution camp. That is the biological lay of the land within the Christian. All this, you remember my first lecture when I said within the big family called the Christian box? Okay, the Catholic, the Orthodox, and the Protestant. All these 3 camps are within there. When it comes to the biblical interpretation, the biblical interpretation becomes a little bit different. You find different camps there. There is one camp called the historical literal, which believe that the biblical account is historical and it should be interpreted in its literal sense. And then you've got something called the historical figurative, which believes that it is historical, it has happened, but the language that is used is figurative language. And the figurative language denotes an actuality of fact, but the language itself is figurative. And then you've got the mythical. The mythical is the group that says that this is completely a myth and a legend. And by the way, I want to make a very clear clarification. Symbolic is not mythical. There are some people within the Christian camp, predominantly in the more liberal Catholic interpreters, okay, that think of the biblical creation as a symbolic event to what happened to all humanity. But it's different than mythical. Mythical, okay, carries within it a legend, carries within it something that has never happened. But the symbolic says it has happened, but the story is there to give us a symbolic meaning. So the meaning is what the symbolic interpretation is looking at, not the exact occurrence of the event. When you look at principles of biblical interpretation, and for sure we can't cover this in 45 minutes, but you have to ask yourself the first question, what is a genre? A genre of the writing, because you know what? You cannot take a book, for example, as the Psalms and Proverbs, which is a poetic book, and compare it to a book which is like Chronicles that talks of historical events, to a book like the Wisdom of Solomon that is wisdom literature. You cannot equate Revelation, which is more apocalyptic literature, and equate that same genre, that same style of writing to, for example, the epistles or the gospels. So you have to be very careful. And this becomes the big question. What does Genesis 1 to 3 fall under? Is it historical to be treated the same as the Chronicles, as 1st and 2nd Kings? Or is it poetic like Psalms? Or is it something in the middle? Number 2, when you say the use of metaphors and similes and figurative speech, this is not mythical. When you, for example, and this is a very simple example, but when you say, for example, oh my God, did you see this car? It was flying on the road. This guy was flying. Well, we know very well when you talk about this that flying, that is a figurative speech. Okay, because actually he was not flying. But does this figurative speech denote something that is happening? That actuality in history has happened? Yes. So although the figurative speech is used, and you cannot take it out of context and say, well, yes, this car was literally flying, on the other side, you cannot say that this is figurative, this didn't mean that the car didn't even exist. So when you are applying figurative speech, you're trying to find out the limitations of the figurative speech. And be sure that you don't go outside of it, nor you make it so restricted that it is meaningless. There's always this big debate of what did the original audience mean? This is like when you study biblical studies, this is a huge, big debate because we know very well that the biblical message was given for all times and all ages. It was transcultural, trans-time. But when you're understanding it right now, we have to also admit that that language, when it was used, when it was written in a context of an original audience that read it. And God, although has the message, be very careful of what I'm talking, has the message that transcends culture and time, the language might not. I'm going to say this again because this is very important. The message of the Bible transcends time and culture, but in some instances, the language might not, because the language, as anyone who studies linguistics and studied culture and studied anthropology, knows that language is conditioned by culture and time. And the Bible uses a language that is used at that point, but the message does not change. Very careful. And by the way, this is what biblical scholars spend their whole life studying. So we can't take it very lightly. Concordism, which is a big issue, because a lot of people right now, especially in this debate, especially the coming from the young earth creationist, the ultra-conservative, the fundamentals, saying, you know what, you bunch of scientists and you bunch of biblical liberal scholars are trying to fit the biblical message that has been there for thousands of years because you want to fit it within the context of the findings of science. And when you do this, this is called concordism, and you know what? You are going to lose because the Bible transcends even all the science. And they give a big example. It's like, well, when people look at the verse, the creator of heavens who stretches them out. And it's actually mentioned that 17 times in the Bible, it's mentioned that God stretches out the heavens. Is this the Big Bang? And people would say, well, hey, the Bible talked about the Big Bang because you know what it says over here, that God stretches the heavens. I don't think so. I don't think so. But that's kind of the danger of concordism. When we are reading the biblical message based on new scientific data that keep coming up and keep changing. Because the biblical message doesn't change. And we can't keep adapting it and changing it all the time based on new scientific evidence. What are the three big problems in Genesis 1 to 3? Here are the three. 1, creation out of nothing. Creation ex nihilo. 2, interpretation of days. 3, what to do with man. What to do with man. You remember when I talked about yesterday the presuppositions, fact-finding that you come up with a belief. The problem that you see a lot in these Christian camps is some of them are unbelievably gung-ho and dogmatic about certain things that they just don't want to look at facts otherwise. And that becomes a problem because they are ridiculed from right and left. So when you look at the biblical lay of the land, okay, you find that all of them agree on biblical inerrancy. Inerrancy at this point is talking about the text. The text itself is inerrant. Why? Because the text has been transmitted through multiple manuscripts, multiple locations, multiple languages, and the text is the text. So the inerrancy is not in the text itself, is in the different kind of interpretation. And you look over here, you've got the literal, you've got the historical context interpretation, and then you've got the figurative. We're going to start with the literal. The literal, their presuppositions is number 1, that God is there. Theism is absolutely mandated. Number 2, that literal biblical revelation. From their standpoint, the presupposition is that when the Bible was revealed, when the Bible was given, it was given as literal as a language as it is. And then no matter what findings that come up as scientific evidence, doesn't change much. And you get the young earth creationist. You all have seen the debate between Kevin Ham and Bill Nyes. It was about 2 years ago. And surprisingly, a lot of churches in the United States showed that. If you would take actually within the United States, about 45 to 50% of evangelicals are in this camp. 45 to 50% of evangelicals are in this camp, which I find it a bit hard sometimes to believe because they are some of the smartest people you'll ever meet. And that's what they endorse. So I respect them, but I have a hard time buying into their beliefs. So we're going to see a couple of slides like this, so please pay attention. Okay? Biblical, the literalist view. Days of creation are 6 24-hour periods. Okay? They are 6 24-hour periods. Sequence of creation as literally mentioned in Genesis 1. So the sequence is exactly as it's mentioned. Age of the universe based on Bishop Ussher, who said that it was 4004 BC. The age of the universe is about 6,000 to 7,000 years. They'll actually even give you a little bit of wiggle room. They'll say, well, we understand very well that the genealogies of Genesis, there was some overlap. Some people, were omitted. They lumped up 3 generations into 1 generation, but they would tell you at a maximum, it's 10,000 years, not more than that. Did death exist prior to fall? The question that was asked in the previous session. For them, no. And this was for all living beings, which I find it very hard biologically. I'm going to talk about the biblical criticism after the slide. But biologically, how can God create a biological system, a sphere, that is sustainable without death to being in it? Because even if we grant that all creatures at that time were vegetarian, well, if you eat a plant, that is death for the plant. So, but for them, for the ultra-fundamental young earth creationists, they do not believe that death existed prior to sin and fall for any kind of living creature. I would ask the question, is this a biologically sustainable system? Their answer is that, and I'm quoting their answer, is that this creation was equivalent, or to be equivalent to the creation in the second coming of Christ, when we don't need to eat or drink. But then the question will become, well, why do you need animals and plants at that point? Are they just to look pretty? So for them, death did not exist. Interpretation of fall, physical and spiritual death. Expulsion from God's presence and evil entering the whole world. Strength of young earth creationists. Number one, it's the most direct, most easy interpretation. If I am a Jew who lived back at the time and I read this, my interpretation will be like, oh, okay, 6 days. I'm fine with that. You take it for face value. Second thing, why would the text in 6 days keep repeating, and so the evening and the morning of day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6? What is the significance of mentioning this? Why is the text? Because usually when you find a text that keeps repeating the same phrase, there is a message there. Why was that message? When they look at the word, the Hebrew word yom, which is very much like an Arabic yom, and you find that how this word is interpreted in other contexts in the biblical text, the Torah, the books of the Jews, yom, for most part, is defined as a 24-hour period, not an indefinite period. So they say, by analogy, if that's how a Jewish reader would read it, then it has to mean 24 hours. Most importantly is for them the commandment when God gave them the 10 commandments and said in Exodus 20, verse 11, "For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them, and rested the seventh. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath." They take it basically, the whole concept of a Sabbath, which is fundamental to the biblical message, was based on this verse that in 6 days God created the heavens and earth. Hence, if you don't believe there are 24 hours, then this is invalidated. They also quote when Jesus said, "Are there not 12 hours in the day?" By the way, the word here is not yom, it's day. And it was a bit of a different context of what he was saying. But this is one of them. This one I love. I love this one. This is actually one of their strongest arguments. They said that this interpretation is timeless. is timeless. Because you know what? No matter what scientific evidence will come, no matter what scientific theory will come, no matter what changes, let's say in 100 years from now, this whole evolution would be completely upside down and a completely new mechanism would be there to explain humanity. Well, at that time, you know what? We didn't really stick to evolution too much like theistic evolution. And they have a very nice saying, a theology that is wed, that is tied to the science of one age is a widow in the next. Very smart play on words. But that's what they say, is like, you know what, if you want a timeless message from the biblical account, do not think about science, whatever it's worth. And then they say, well, you know what, also in the Genesis accounts it says that, you know what, creation where everything was according to its kind. And they look at this right now, look at the current organism in the creation. Every kind is by itself. You can't breed a dog and a cat and come up with a dog cat. And they say, look at the current evidence and that this is according to its kind. And when God said they created him according to this kind, it has to be taken at its value. Challenges of young earth creationists. Since the time of the church father Origen, he's actually the one who actually brought this argument, and several others very much so. If you are saying there are 24-hour periods, and we know that the sun was created in day 4, how would you make sense of that? What were the 24 hours prior to this? Here are the, because it doesn't make sense, because a 24-hour period as a time is a factor of the earth revolving around itself. And before the creation of the sun and the day, and that there is a day and night, okay, you don't have that time factor. But their answers would be as follows. That God created actually the sun from day 1, it appeared on day 4, but since it was there since day 1, okay, that time was consistent with a 24-hour period. I don't know if you buy that, but that's their argument. Another argument that they say is that actually in the beginning of creation is very much like the end of creation. In the beginning, God was the light of the earth. Just like at the end when you look in Revelation, when it says about our Lord Jesus Christ, he's going to be its sun. So they said like beginning, like the end. So in the very first 3 days, God was the light. And then the sun was created on day 4. But he asked him, well, what is then, where do the 24 hours come from? And they say, well, what's against God making the time and defining the time? I find it's a bit of a stretch because time is a factor of our nature. Okay? God is not confined. God is not going to set the clock, okay? Because this is a natural phenomenon. So having God to be the source of light in the first 3 days, and he's the one who's setting the 24 hours, I think is a stretch of the text. Another challenge, when you look at actually Genesis 1, verse 11, it says over here, let the earth bring forth grass, the herb that yields the seed, and the fruit that yields fruit according to its kind. And most people would debate, would say this, you know what, if I'm a farmer from the Jewish audience who's reading this book, I know very well that when the earth is bringing up a plant and a seed and a full tree that brings up fruit, it doesn't take 24 hours, it takes a lot more than that. So why would the text say at that point, let the earth bring up? Because there is a component of actually the earth, that's going through a natural cycle. That's what they're trying to say. That based on this text, there is a natural cycle of plant growth. And this natural cycle of plant growth is more than 24 hours. They would counter and say, well, you know what? Who's to say that God cannot just miraculously in one day, make the earth come up all quickly, the plants will come up. I think it's a stretch of the text. Another challenge of young earth creationists. When you guys look at Genesis, so anyone who's read the gospel would know, the Bible would know that actually you've got 2 creation narratives, one in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. In Genesis 2, it goes and revolves more around Adam. But when you look at Genesis 2 and you look at the events after Adam was created, and this is reported in Genesis 2, God created Adam, and then he brought to Adam all the animals of the creation so that he may name them. And after he may name them, he created Eve. Based at least, if I take the text at face value, how can you fit all this in a 24-hour period? It's just not logical. If you want to stick by the 24-hour period, it's just not doable. Unless you interpret Genesis 1 in a literal fashion and Genesis 2 in a non-literal fashion. but at that point you are cherry picking. So another argument against them. So one of them say that, you know what, the word yom in Hebrew language means 24-hour periods, but it's been very, very clear that the word yom in the same text, because you're not bringing it up from another part of the Bible, within the same Genesis narrative, there is one occurrence that yom does not mean 24-hour period. Genesis 2:4. It says, in the generation of the earth and heaven, in the day the Lord created them. So that's the word yom. And that clearly at that point is not referring to a 24-hour period. So you can't be just too dogmatic and say, well, yom at this point means a 24-hour period, and assume that. And then the last argument, which is very, very interesting. Out of the first 6 days, every one of them, it says that there was an evening and a morning, except for the day 7. Except for day 7. Day 7 is the only day that does not have an evening and morning, and that's the day that God rested and enjoyed the creation with his humanity. And we know for sure, based on that, this is not a 24-hour period, right? So if that yom, the 7th day, is referred to as a yom, how can you interpret this as a non-24-hour period, yet you interpret the first 6 as 24-hour periods? Either you stick to your same rule throughout your interpretation or not. So if yom is referred to the first 6 days as 24-hour period, but then in the 7th day is not, you're cherry picking. And then the question becomes in Exodus. When God said, well, you know what, as in 6 days God created and then the 7th day he rested. Is that referring to 24-hour periods or referring to a pattern of days week? It's a pattern. God worked and then rested. And similarly, in that same pattern, you work and then you rest to enjoy the relationship, because that day 7 is a day of enjoyment of relationship with God. So God worked, created, and then the 7th day was a day of rest to enjoy the relationship with creation. So is it a pattern or is it the number of days? And this is the theological challenge. So I find this very interesting. Listen to this. So when a young earth creation scientist becomes challenged and says, well, you interpret the Bible that it's 7,000 to 8,000 years maximum, but yet the universe, okay, is appearing to us by measurement of light speed that is 14 to 15 billion years. And the earth, the fossils, when you're doing your carbon dating, appears to be at least 5 billion years. How do you mix those two together? And their theological interpretation, which I find it very hard, is that God, when he created the universe and mankind, 7,000 to 8,000 years, created it with the appearance of age. What does that mean? They'll give you an example. So based on their belief that Adam was created, special creation instantaneously, they will tell you when Adam was created, what did he appear to be like? Let's say a 25-year-old man. Okay? But is in his actuality, how old was he? Maybe a couple of minutes, a couple of seconds. But what did he appear? 25 years old. So he was created with the appearance of age, yet he was only 1 or 2 minutes truly old. And by the same analogy, the universe, although it is 7,000 to 8,000 years old, it appears it is 15 billion years old. The same analogy of Adam. And they cite a very, very interesting biblical support of that, and I find it very creative. That's the word I can say. They say the miracle of our Lord Jesus Christ in Cana of Galilee when he changed the water to wine. And they say, so what did Jesus do at that time? He changed the water to wine, right? And this just changed right that. But yet when they gave the wine to people to taste, what did they say of the wine? This wine is what? Is aged. Right? So although he created like that, but it was of age. And by the same analogy, God, in the beginning of creation of time, could create The whole universe that is 7,000 to 8,000 years old, yet it appears of age that is 15 billion years for a universe, 5 billion years for Earth, and that same analogy. I think theologically that's very, 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 very hard to grasp. Because why would God then put all these fossils? Why would God put all these strata? Why would God make this carbon dating? Why would God give us that appearance of the light? Why would God give us the appearance of the galaxies? It just doesn't make sense. Because then it puts God into this whole point of, he's a trickster. He's tricking us. And some of them, when you talk to them theologically, you say, well, God is doing this to test our faith. I find it hard. Okay? That God is specifically doing this to create it on a certain age while it's not. And He creates this elaborate biological system and this whole universe that we have just to test us. I'm not sure that I buy that. The second camp is the camp of the progressive creationists and the old earth creationists. And William Lane Craig, which a lot of you know, is probably in this camp. But in this camp, they're one big family, and within this family there are a lot of different interpretations. What do they all have in common? Well, number one, it's theism. Absolutely, they believe in God. Number two, it's context Bible revelation, that the Bible, the biblical story of creation, was given as a context. You have to understand it within its context. The problem when they debate between each other is, what is this context? So there's a lot of different families, and this is the number of them. Okay? What they're being attacked on is that, they're trying to fit their biblical interpretation based on the current scientific evidence. Because all of a sudden, within the last 50 to 100 years, okay, as biblical commentators, you were faced with scientific evidence that tells you, by the way, the universe is not only 7,000, 8,000 years old, it's 14 billion years old. Then you have to fit this time into your biblical interpretation. So then, the first group is called the gap theory. The gap theory came out about 50 years ago, and it fell out of favor. What is the gap theory? They tell you that, Genesis 1, when God created, it says in the beginning, right? These are the opening words. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. From the perspective of the scholars that endorsed this, they said, in the beginning, everything was made. This was done about maybe 15 billion years ago, because the science tells us it's 15 billion years ago. But then, Genesis 1:2, there was a gap, because it says the earth was without form and void. And they attribute this gap, and I'll tell you this is a stretch, but this is their biblical interpretation, that because of the devil and Satan's fall, okay, he wreaked havoc and chaos on the earth. So God's creation, He came and messed it up. So then, for about billions of years, this was a gap, until more recently, in our modern time, 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, God rearranged and recreated in the 6 days and restored to good the original creation. So that was the gap theory. That, yes, the universe was about 15 billion years old, but because of devil's work, it was messed up for all these billions of years until about 7,000, 8,000 years ago, which then matches with our biblical account, okay, of our understanding. So, it's 24 hours followed by a gap between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. It's billions of years. Death existed, yes, through Satan's work. The strength of the gap theory is actually one strength. When you look at the Hebrew verbs, you see that there is a change in the tense of the verb between Genesis 1 and Genesis 3. In Genesis 1 to 2, it's a perfect tense. In Genesis 3 and onwards, it's a narrative tense. However, modern biblical and Hebrew scholars take it that actually Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 is more of the title of what happened after that. And that's where there's a change in the tense. It's not that because something happened in the past, and then from there onward, the 6 days was a different account. Second group, called the day-age theory. And this is proposed by, one of the most prominent people in this area is Hugh Ross. Very, very, very prominent NASA scientist. This theory is that the age of the earth is billion of time, day one. And then God created in 6 undefined periods. That's why it's called an age. The day represents an age. 6 unidentified periods which could be overlapping, and this could be billions of years until we come up to the current status. So it is 6 periods of prolonged time, but not limited to 24 hours. The sequence may not necessarily be literal, but does not exclude it. So some of those, as I said, within these camps, you might find some fine-tuning. So some of them overlap, but some could overlap and some could not. Age of the universe, billions of years. Creation of Adam, however, is a special creation, instantaneous of age ex nihilo. So this is actually, I'll be honest with you, this is a view that I find a lot of our, Coptic Orthodox believers feel comfortable with. Because we do understand that it was from, and I'll actually show you some patristics writings about this. The patristics were actually relatively 2 camps. You had the camp of St. Basil and St. John Chrysostom, who were extremely prolific in this area. They're actually very, very, very much like young earth creationists. They do believe that was their interpretation, that it was 6 days, as is, the earth is young. And then you find on the other camp, somebody like St. Gregory of Nyssa. You find some few writings of St. Athanasius. You find some few writings of St. Cyril. Both of St. Cyril and St. Athanasius did not write much in this, because they were more involved in the whole point of the incarnational theology. Well, what does it mean to be on the image of God? And then St. Augustine. But you find those 2 camps. But in general, this is the view that a lot of us hold, that actually Adam is out of the picture. So the whole universe could have evolved in those billions of years, and those 6 periods are denoting 6 prolonged periods. Challenges of the day age is that if the days represent ages, a non-overlapping sequence does not match our current understanding of the universe. So if we are doing this interpretation to match the billions of years the universe has been around, well, does the sequence matter? Does the sequence matter? It does. If you're going to adopt a long, ancient universe, then the sequence, at least biologically, has to make sense, because you find, for example, Earth before the sun, and we know that didn't happen by what we know from cosmology. The vegetations, day 3 before the marine creatures, we know that is not what the biological theory does not hold to. Birds and marines created together, hard to make sense of that. But then if you say, well, you know what, those were overlapping. There was not necessarily one day and then after the other. So basically, in a certain age, you had insects on which birds fed, and those birds had vegetation, so there was overlap in the time. So those come in sequence, but there's overlap, just like you see over here. But then how you make sense with so, the evening, and the morning of? Because it seems that the so, the morning, and the evening of gives you a little bit of a defining period, one thing after the other. If you are going to put an interpretation that want to expand it to the 15 billion years, you got to think a little bit about what does the sequence mean. And then you get the day gap theory. The day gap theory, John Lennox is a professor in Oxford, amazing guy. He wrote a beautiful book called, I think, The First 7 Days. He believes that actually the days were 24-hour periods, but then between them, there was gaps of unidentified time. And his thought behind this is that actually in the day, like the first day, the second day, the third day, the fourth day, God spoke of the creation. But then the creation came to fruition over the period of time. So then it is 24-hour period. Okay, so they are 6 24-hour periods, because then it would make sense this is the morning and the evening of the first day, the second day, the third day. But in between, there are prolonged periods of time in between them. The age of the universe is billions of years. Creation of Adam is still special creation. It's kind of amazing when you look at an Oxford professor like that writing a book, really impressive when he talks about the creation of man. You know what? He still fully believes that creation of man was special creation, ex nihilo, instantaneous, and yes of age. And by the way, all these group of families, when it comes to death, they believe that death existed prior to fall, yes, for all creation, except for man. So animals, plants, all that, death did exist as part of the biological nature. But since mankind was a special creation out of nothing, instantaneous, 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, death did not exist until after sin and after fall. The pros and cons of the day gap. Number one, it preserves the integrity of the 24-hour period. Okay, that actually it does say, you know what, this is the evening and the day, the morning of day 1, day 2 until day 6. So it preserves that. Number 2, it preserves the concept of creation by fiat, which is basically that God spoke. God spoke. He said, "Let there be," and the creation started. And they base it also on that actually the days in Hebrew are not labeled first day, second day, third day, because when you look at those first, second, third day, you think of automatically like what? A week. But they're actually labeled day 1, day 2, day 3, which gives a sense of, you know what, those could be separate. Well, you know what, I did this in one day, and then in day 2, which is somewhere else, I did another thing. It's a bit of a tough argument, but that's one of the things that they do, or they interpret it.